Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the self as a container, as well as mythology and how that becomes related to the self and the container that we hold, according to Jungian psychology. So let's jump in. The image that you're seeing on the screen is a picture of Liverpool, and Carl Jung believed that this was a profound metaphor for him of the self, where a city becomes a microcosm for the macro that is the human experience, with all of these little alleyways and road maps. And so, as we're guiding our psyches into a deeper map of consciousness and awareness of self, I invite you to try on the metaphor of being a microcosm for the macro. And so we can see this as it applies to nature, but we can also see this as it applies to technological developments, buildings, cities, and maps. So let's jump in. Here are the learning outcomes for today. We'll take a quick review of personhood as understood by Myers-Briggs and some of the attributes that Jung outlined in his original work. We'll take a look at the definition of self via the mediation of opposites. We'll look at mandalas and the pool of life, and then we'll talk about mythology in different cultures. We're going to ground primarily into Hindu mythology, as well as have a discussion on life stages. So take a moment, jot those down, kind of refresh your memory on personality types and Carl Jung. So, if you recall, in 1921, Jung published a book titled Psychological Types, which he focused on these four attributes of extroversion, introversion, sensation, intuition, thinking versus feeling, judging, and perceiving. And he eventually quantified them into 16 personality types. And we know that these models are widely used by organizations for assessment, team building, coaching, and even self-study. So just to recap of these different personality types, they're a tool for self-study more than anything, and they allow us to mediate the place between self and persona. So in this model of Jungian psychology, we can see that we have the external reality, we have persona, and then ego is what helps us mediate the rejected parts of self, right? Shadow. And the self is a circle. Carl Jung would also say that the self isn't just in the center of this diagram, and you can see there's an overlap between ego, persona, shadow, and animus, but it's also a container. So I would argue that the self, while it's situated right in the middle, it also is situated on these outer edges of the container. So let's jump into what is self. So according to Jung, the self originates from an inborn and dynamic structure that helps us integrate essential parts of the brain and the mind. And so part of this integration is going to help us mediate instinctual behaviors and archetypal experiences. So when we're thinking of archetypal experiences, we're also thinking about how at a certain moment in time, we may have more resonance with certain images. And so some of those images might be being more in the mediator role of motherhood, which is an archetype that might be alive or present for you. Or perhaps it's the archetype of sage if you're doing this deep self study and academic work. So the self is the mediator between this primary archetype we hold in the psyche, as well as this instinctual behavior that we have through the brain-body connection. He also describes self as signifying the unification of consciousness and unconsciousness in a person, which recognize the self as a whole. So, self versus person, I think, is the next question that emerges. So, if self is the container, and we know that personality stems from the 4 attributes into 16 different types, then what exactly is the difference between self and person? So, let's take a deeper look at that. Self, therefore, not a structure of the psyche, but rather the full container of the psyche, not a fixed structure, but one which is fluid and ever changing and has continuity by means of self organization. The inner personality, in contrast, is the way one behaves in relationship to the inner process and resembles inner attitudes, characteristics that get turned outward and project the unconscious. So, inner personality is the mediation of attitudes that get turned outward, and the self is not a fixed structure, but fluid and changing and a means of self organization. So, self, more self organization, and personality, more what gets projected outwards. So, in the textbook, the Handbook of Jungian Psychology, there's a really great section on major definitions of the self. So, I included a few of them here, but I thought I'd share with a broader list with you. So, he says, Carl Jung, that the self exists from the very beginning and that it is actually the individuation, which is the process of bringing a latent self into consciousness. And this makes the self more of a child like quality that's trying to be born out of the womb of consciousness. And so, with that, Jung talks about the relationship between individualization and kind of like a snake shedding its skin or just growing into these new versions of self. So, for Carl Jung, the self had a range of meanings, but included all of the following: individuality, so something that makes you unique, a midpoint between what's unconscious and what is conscious in the mind, as well as the union of opposites, archetypes, and wholeness. And so the container becomes analogous with self. And so self is always trying to move through these different layers. And while the ego is an essential part of self, it becomes the mediator to help us birth into new ways of being and individuate from places that are different and identities that are different from the ones that were given as a child. So when we're looking at the layers of self, we can see that it holds and plays out in the external structure of reality. So we're looking at social construction. You get dressed in the morning, you walk out your door. People may say, oh, you are a female, or they may say, oh, you are a male. And so there's all of these stereotypes of perception that get placed on you just by existing. Or if we look at social construction of society, we know that, in the United States, we drive on the right-hand side of the road, or green means go and red at a stoplight means stop. So these are all part of the external reality that we operate in. And then the persona is more about how we'd like to be perceived than how it actually is. And so we can see this image here of what the person is actually wearing is very different than the projection of that personality. And so we can see how much that really interplays with things like social media or Facebook or any type of Instagram or TikTok. It is what we're seeing as persona, but not the actual individual. And so the individual is that which is moving through the layers of consciousness and shedding off and deconstructing ways of being that were handed down through childhood, ways of being that are given, not chosen, even through language. If we look at certain languages like Spanish, everything is gendered. We can say el sol, the masculine sun, la luna. So all of these aspects of the feminine moon are something that we are constructed. So we're moving out of those. And then the collective unconscious is still part of self because it's where the myth lives, it's where the archetype lives. And it tells us which patterns right now we're pulling and pulling all the way through to self, to persona, even through ego. So for Jung, as we're looking at defining self, it's encompassing a whole, which then acts as a container. Okay, are you ready? I'm really excited about this map. So just take a moment, take a look. So you can see that it's a more colorful way to see where the myth lives. So myth lives in collective unconscious, not personal unconscious. And then we have access points to it. So you may be working with the myth of non-binary, right? Or androgynous beings in ancient mythology. Or you may be dealing with the motif of Great Mother or trickster, joker. And so, with all of these aspects, self often gets worked out in the later stage of life. And so, part of the ego self access argues that the original state of oneness can be expressed through a snake swallowing its own tail. And we're going to talk a lot more about the snake metaphor as we go. And so, in this symbol of the snake swallowing its own tail, the original state of self becomes individual consciousness and a state of primary oneness with no difference. So you emerge as your own entity like the snake, and then it eats its own tail, which suggests a parallel between mother and infant relationship, or ego and self, or creator and creation. And so the metaphor that often gets suggested with the snake eating its tail is that as development proceeds and more autonomy is given, the result is the self withdraws, thinking it is egalitarian, it's uniform, but it's only until a true transformation that it goes back into oneness or consciousness. So for Carl Jung, it is very much the snake eating its own tail of individuating only to go back to the collective, finding uniqueness only to go back to oneness of all that is. So pretty cool. And I think that this chart here in this slide really represents that theme of the ego self axis that often gets defined as the snake eating its tail. All right. So as we've been chatting about self as a container, for Jung, this encompassed the self, but it wasn't just symbolized as a circle, as we've seen in several of these images, but it also served as a square or a mandala. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what the mandala meant for Jung and how he used it as a mediator of self-study, but also his dream work. So you can see in these images, I have an image of a kaleidoscope, which a kaleidoscope is a really beautiful metaphor for reality, right? In a singular object, we can produce hundreds, if not thousands, of interpretation of the same objective reality. And with that, and I know we've chatted a lot about sacred geometry and other classes and some of the Fibonacci sequence and how numerology, mathematics, and geometric shapes are also these building blocks of expressions that coil out and go back into self, which again is the metaphor of individuating only to be eaten by the collective again. So you can see that here we have the kaleidoscope as a metaphor for worldviews, for realities, for even layers of the chakra, right? Because if we look at layering a mandala onto the chakra system, we know that of the 7 chakras in Hindu psychology, we have a certain geometric shape and energy that's associated with each one. So we know for the root, where our Mula Bandha lives, the themes here are all about creating security. And we know for our sacral chakra, it's very much about creating sexuality, creativity, and it really is the themes of power, being overpowered, feeling underpowered, and kind of like taking your right place where you're an empress in your life, which means you don't have to over control or overrule, but there's a balance between that. And when that's out of balance, it just looks like the archetype of a martyr. And so each of the chakras have these geometric shapes associated, as well as archetypal images and lessons associated. As we move up to the 3rd level, it's all about confidence, color yellow. And as we look at the um, the center of confidence just under the solar plexus, that's about trusting our instinct, learning even how to be in tune with our own dreams, our own synchronicities in life. And so where we check in with that is really our seat of confidence. So again, if that's out of balance, we're unable to access that fully. And then our reality, our kaleidoscope, becomes about themes of confidence. And so we might think, everyone experiences this because I'm currently in a phase of consciousness where I'm projecting out one life lesson. So if you're working on root chakra, you might feel like everyone's barely making it, or we're not surviving, or the economy is going to collapse, which, there's a lot of truth to that. But if that becomes the only vista that you can see your life, you begin to think that's the only way it is. Same with heart issues, or same with sexuality. If perhaps your sexuality has been dormant and you haven't explored it, you just may experience the entire world in themes of sexual hierarchy or objectification of human bodies. And you may really think that that is how the world is. But the moment you shift, like just a small shift in the kaleidoscope, there are completely different colors, there's completely different themes, there's completely different matrix patterns of consciousness that you're unlocking and opening and working with. And so in a life, it's not like this singular progression where it's, I'm going to work on root issues, sacral issues, confidence, and then I'll move up to the heart, and then I'll move up to truth, and then I'll move up to my 3rd eye and the crown. Sometimes people get stuck, right? They get stuck in never looking below the belly button is kind of how I position it, where they're really about heart-centered themes or about transpersonal psychology, but they don't know how to, you know, communicate to someone with love, or they don't know how to hold the door open, or they're only sleeping 4 hours or 3 hours a night, right? And we know that to be fully embodied requires that we have touched in, we've tuned into these different aspects of reality, and we allow these centers in the body and these centers in life to flow without getting stuck in a certain phase. So perhaps, you're working with sacral themes in your current projections of life or your current mandalas. And so you may see a lot of synchronicity around animals coming to speak with you, around meeting certain people at the right time, the right place, adding in something. So with this whole class, as we're coming to an awareness, as we're in this place of studying dreams, as we're in this place of self-observation, what we find is our dream world is giving us all of these beautiful nuggets and intentions and pearls about our waking life and about what chakra system we're working in or where we might be might be stuck or where we might be healing and allowing things to flow. So as we're considering the self, considering the mandalas that we're working with are really important. So over to the left, you'll see this kind of yellow-orange mandala. This was actually the last one that Carl Jung stopped drawing. He had a dream, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but I just wanted to point out that this was the last one he drew until he had this insight of self and was like, okay, I'm done with my drawings in this way, and I can take a break because I've unpacked and uncovered. So it's kind of like the snake eating its tail where it went back in. So, and then up next, we see the second image over is actually just used in traditional ceremony of opening up directions and gateways. And so each direction is associated with parts of the body and different levels of consciousness. So opening up gates, especially when we're doing things like indigenous medicine or energy medicine, you can learn how to open up gates and close gates. So this second one serves as a mandala that represents opening and closing different planes of reality. And then the third one, as I mentioned, is the kaleidoscope, which is this metaphor for epistemology or philosophical framework. So, we are in a state of late stage capitalism. Before that was capitalism, and then we had modernity, and so we're always in these collective phases that are really big, and then our own personal phases. And so it's like a shape within a shape, a circle within a circle. And so let's jump in and look a little bit more at how Carl Jung was using this aspect of dream work and mandala self-study. So this is from the book Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, page 223, if you want to take a read of it, and you have that book. So he says in the dream, I found myself in a dirty soot city. It was night, winter, dark, raining. I was in Liverpool with a number of Swiss, say half a dozen. I walked through the dark streets. I had the feeling that they were coming from the harbor and that the real city was actually up above on the cliffs. So we climbed up there. It reminded me of Basel, where there was a market down below, and you'd go in and see the Alley of the Dead, which led to a plateau. When we reached the plateau, we found a broad square, dimly lit but illuminated streetlights, where all of these beautiful lights converged. And then the various quarters of the city were arranged around the square. In the center was a round pool, and in the middle, a small island. While everything was round, it was still obscured by fog, smoke, dim light. It was as if everything stood on a single tree, a magnolia in a shower of reddish blossoms. It was through the tree that sunlight and the source of light became the same. My companions commented on the abominable weather and obviously didn't see the tree or the patterns. They spoke of another Swiss who was living in Liverpool and expressed surprise that he should settle there. I was carried away by the beauty of this flowering tree and the sunlight pouring through. I know why very well he settled here. And then I awoke. So I have a few more pieces and complimentary comments from Jung on this dream. But before we jump into his perspectives, just like we analyze any dream, we start with what hits you first. What stands out to you the most about that reflection of his dream in Liverpool? And for me, the magnolia and the center is like, whoa, that's so powerful. The other thing that stood out is all of this dirt and soot and mess, and how there was this theme of it being dirty. And then, of course, as he's describing the dream, you can hear, and for me at least, get this real visual hit that he's not describing a city, he's describing a geometric shape and a very clear mandala, because as he's saying, he's like, there was a circle center, and then out from that there were various quarters arranged up on this square, and then in the square was a center, a pool, and then in a pool was another pool by rain and fog, and then even on top of that was the tree. So what we're seeing is really this map of darkness and dirty all around, and then beauty. So it very much is a lotus motif. And so I invite you to do a little exploration with that dream and just even jot down what are the three objective objects or symbols that come online for you. And then, of course, you can always consult a dream dictionary for an objective perspective, and then just let it sit. So for Carl Jung, what stood out to him is the individual quarters of the dream arranged around a center point. Another aspect of the dream that stood out, he says, I can still see the colors, like grayish yellow raincoats, wetness of rain. It sounds very much like a Monet or just like an impressionistic painting where you're getting more of a sense of place than you are even what you're visually seeing. If you've ever lived somewhere really rainy, the light is very special in places where it rains a lot. So he also says that this grayish color and the light are important aspects of his dream. But what was important was that this metaphor was the pool of life, right? There was a pool in the center of the square, and everything was completely unpleasant, black, opaque. But then, he says, I have the vision of unearthly beauty, and that is why I was able to live at all. Liverpool is the pool of life, the liver. According to an old view, it is a seat of life, that which makes to live. So here we are again with these oppositions that exist within the human psyche, that exist within the microcosm and the macrocosm of tension, of disgust, a dirty city, it being rainy and dark. And then from that emerging this beautiful tree and all of this light and consciousness. So this dream became the pool of life. And it was a very profound dream for him. So I have a picture of a younger individual here on the slide, and she or they appears to be reading a book, and from this book or dream journal outcrops an octopus and a boat and globes and sky and even some mushrooms and fish, where there's all of this data just coming in through the consciousness, coming up to ego, coming up to anima, coming up to personality. And so what he says about this dream was, I saw here that the goal had been revealed. One could not go beyond the center. The center is the goal of everything. Everything is directed back towards the center. And through this dream, I understood the self is a principle and an archetype of orientation and meaning. Therein lies its healing function. For me, this insignified the approach to the center and therefore to my goal. It emerged out of linking my personal myth. After this dream, he completely gave up drawing and painting mandalas because the dreamer depicted the climax of the whole process of development. Wow, right? At least that's what comes up for me. It's like the end of Lord of the Rings, all 4 movies or something, right? Or if you're a Star Wars fan, it's like, oh my gosh, it all started back to the beginning where the snake ate its tail. And so this was the big climax for him, and really this big climax of um, our class and our time together. This is a climactic moment where we've been building up to how do we work with dreams? What is the ego? What is the shadow? What is the anima? What are all of these key structures that are in the personality? And why are we here? What does it all mean? And for Carl Jung, this dream about Liverpool summed all of that up, right? It's the gross and dirty experience of humanity, but also this beautiful light and growth. And so this joining of these two things became the climax of his whole process of development that allowed him to link to his own myth. So cool. So the activity for today, and you'll see a little worksheet on this as well, is to look at the mandalas emerging from moments of our own intense personal growth. So their appearance indicates that a profound rebalancing is underway in the psyche. The result of the process that is more complex and a better integrated personality. So in my artwork, I found over the last 20 years that I've been doing oil painting or sketching, that this has been a shift and a motif that's really valuable to me, is just noticing as I free draw, as I free write, as I free sketch, what geometric shapes and patterns and mandalas come up. Sometimes I'm in a place of more hard angles, like triangles, which we know are about fire. And other times I'm in a place of more circle, which we know can be about water. And rectangles are very much about Earth, planet Earth, the squareness of things. When we look at metal, sometimes there's associated with a hexagon because the three fields of a rectangle indicate the solid base, that's offered by the 90-degree angles. And the rectangle can be associated with this metal quality that's found right in the center of the hexagon. So we talked about fire and triangles and three. Water is always one. And then, of course, for wood comes from water. And so it's the hexagon that occurs within the center of a circle. I know, it's so cool. I get so excited about drawing and sketching. So what I'll invite you all to do is, if you'd like, this week, and you don't need to be, like a professional artist of the sort that you have good command over shading or replication of objects in nature, but really there is no right or wrong way to do this. It's just self-expressing. So I'll invite you to draw a mandala as a self-portrait, just to see what area of consciousness you're working with within the 7 chakras of the body, and what themes of life are coming through as most pertinent in your soul's journey or lesson. So Jung believed that the appearance of these shapes or patterns is a profound way to rebalance and help to restructure energy flows from the unconscious into personhood, into self. So with that being said, we're going to move into our next content area for today, which is talking about myth and life stages. So we know that the human progresses through childhood, youth, middle life, and old age. He believed that we traverse through this life very much like the sun traverses across the sky. And I just find that to be such a beautiful metaphor, because it's so short. If we look at a day, right? From when the sun rises to when it hits peak time in the sky to when it sets, it's just such a brief process. It's like an exhale and then it's done. And so the human life and reincarnation is very much of that same cadence as we step out in perspective. So let's talk a little bit more about culture and myth as this way to be checking in with what are our soul's lesson while we're incarnated right now on planet Earth. And so in the book Archetype, an author Stevens, who does a lot on Jungian psychology and writing, who we've chatted about before, suggests that the two disciplines of ethology and analytical psychology really provides us with this way to understand our human psyche as well as our biology. So kind of moving from reptilian brain, which we know is our more instinctual self, to mammalian brain, which can be getting bogged down by too many emotions, emotional overload from family, and then just also these narratives of primate history. And so he believed that in getting in touch with culturally influenced archetypes, we can make better use of our biology. So let's talk about some mythology here. In Hindu mythology, solar eclipses are caused by a decapitated head. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk about this. Let's see. So, we know that Rahu represents the head and Ketu is the body, and they're known as the luminaries. And why I bring them in and why I bring them in now, right? There's a plethora of myth from various cultures across the world, from Latin America, from China, from India, from Nordic countries, Canada, the US, that we could pull in. But I chose Hindu mythology, one, because I love it, but two, because I think it really fits back into Carl Jung's theme of the snake eating its own tail, and that being his quintessential moment of understanding what the self is and where personhood fits into all of that is we individuate and become unique and figure it all out, only to return back to nothing. And what a beautiful metaphor. It's like once you've become the Gandhi or the Buddha or Jesus Christ, right, in a Christian tradition, then all there is left to do is become nobody. And so there are a lot of philosophers, Alan Watts, Ram Dass, who talk about this notion of the self becoming no one, that only is possible in the self-realization as the metaphor that we saw in Liverpool. So with Rahu and Ketu, they date back to early times, and some of the oldest written myth that we know of. And so I'll tell you how the story goes. So it's all about the Devas. And so there was Turing, a turning in the ocean of Amriti, the elixir of life. And this elixir of life is something that everyone wanted because they wanted to defy humanity. And so these titans were very envious of the gods, the Brahmins who had this access, and they wanted it as well. And so one of the titans dressed up as this beautiful woman and got just a sip on his lips before he was decapitated for drinking the nectar from Amriti. And so the head is known as Rahu and the tail is Ketu. And since then, Rahu is constantly chasing the sun, which represents life's purpose and father, and moon, which represents the mind or the mother, as revenge for separating the head. So it's a popular belief that when they succeed in catching the sun or the moon by swallowing them, it causes a solar or lunar eclipse. But they can only hold on to them for so long before the sun and moon emerge again. So this story is very well known in India. It's very basic and foundational in astrology. But why I think it's important now to bring it in is wherever in your astrology chart, and I know I've done astrology charts for many of you, and it is such an honor to be your guide in that life map, seeing what house you have your Rahu and your Ketu tells you and gives you insight really into what mandala or what chakra you're going to work with in this lifetime. In that, it shows you where there might have been kinks or ego trips or complexes in past lives. And when we're able to sort those out, when we're able to neutralize those aspects of family karma aspects of individual karma, aspects of deity consciousness that we carry within us. When we're able to create equilibrium in those things, what happens is we achieve realization. And in that deep realization, all we do is go back to source. So it's this beautiful, big unfolding and then turning back into self. So it's a big expansion only to pull in more contraction. So I think that Hindu mythology is a really nice way to talk about some primary myths and how they show up in our self-study work. It also points to the tension of opposites that Carl Jung talks about with the notions of the anima and animus. And again, I really want to take home, we don't have to perceive that in a gendered way. I really take more of a non-binary lens of just what in sexual relationships or intimate partnerships are you holding as your opposite. So Ketu and Rahu are also this principle that I think in a way really hold true of the anima and animus principle as well in a Hindu perspective, because the sun represents body and moon is the mind. So it's like mind body connection. And then of course, this really takes the metaphor of microcosm to macro in a very concrete way. So we can see that Rahu Ketu basically move access points throughout the sky. So wherever Rahu moves 10 degrees, Ketu also follows. So in a chart, we can look at these two nodes as a point of unification karmically. And then we can also look in the night sky or NASA or follow solar flares and see how this is playing out in the external world. So just to recap for today, we talked about a review on just personality. We spent a lot of time discussing the difference between self and personhood. And then we took a deeper dive into looking at mandalas as, or mandala drawing through the lens of Carl Jung's dream in Liverpool, but also how it can be a tool of self-study and artistic expression for you. So all of my artwork, and I'll bring some in next week, I'll see if I can get it on the PowerPoint, is really related to this theme about how do we take these geometric shapes as teachers, as communicators. We also spoke a little bit about just a recap, a review on how the different 5 elements show up in shapes. Water is the circle and represents 1. Wood is 2 because water comes out of wood and represents the hexagon because it fits within a circle. And then 3 is fire, and fire can divide the hexagon. And we know that a triangle has 3 points. And the metal is all about this theme of order. And within metal, we see the rectangle, and rectangles are metal. And then of course, earth is square. Earth is always going to be this nice tight shape of earth. So, I mean, this applies to so many domains, like even looking at wedding rings or marital bonding, like being very aware of those symbols. Like, is the person wearing a triangle, which is about fire in a relationship? Did they choose a circular ring about water or oneness? Or did they do a square ring? I personally, in my ring, for my committed partnership, went for square because I wanted to pull in themes of earth, beautiful comfort home, and just a grounded relationship instead of a fiery one or a metallic one with a lot of boundaries or borders. So just thinking about how the shapes that are coming up from your drawing also are things we can interpret. So that will be your activity, is to draw a self-portrait using any geometric shapes that call to you. And you get to decide how big or small you want to make this and really take it from there. So feel free to send me a snapshot of your drawings. I would think it would be really cool to be able to share some of the artwork of the class on our next PowerPoint slide as we kind of look into synchronicity and some other Jungian themes. And we'll go from there. So hopefully that's a useful activity. And just if you need some more references, here are some of the books we're working with, which is Whitmont and Pereira's Portal to the Source, Stevens, The Handbook of Jungian Psychology, as well as Papados' book on Jungian psychology, Some of the Myths from India, and of course, Carl Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. So I hope the rest of your day is really beautiful, really sweet and soft, and just bustling with synchronicity and insights from your unconscious mind. So as always, feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and I cannot wait to be in connection with you again soon.